好，为度化一切众生，请大家发无上的菩提心。今天我们继续讲。
Today, let's continue with the classes on the Surangama Sutra. In fact, before this, I would like to make a short announcement.
今年记了法会前面吧。
This year,
闭关的话呢，
we will have the retreat, the annual retreat, and the mantra that we would chant during the annual retreat is Amitabha's mantra. The requirement and the plan of this year for the annual retreat is chanting 1 million of the Tibetan mantra, the mantra in Tibetan, or 6 million in chanting the name of Amitabha if you were to chant this in Chinese. So this year the main practice is Amitabha practice. Therefore, wherever you are, the Sangha and the classes that we have over here in Larangar, I hope that you prepare yourself to be reborn in Sukhavati, the Pure Land, because we will have eventually to die, and I think you should be prepared to be reborn in the Pure Land. Ponzo Rinpoche, in fact, spoke before and taught that whomsoever made an auspicious connection with him will be reborn in Pure Land. Therefore, we should make preparation for these. Every year, I usually would go out and teach and so on. And I don't really know when I will die. Therefore, I think I should at least finish part of this 1 million of recitation of mantra. Therefore, I would like to make this short announcement before the actual class so that you can be prepared. That's the content of annual retreat practice. And this year we practice the practice of Amitabha, so we should be prepared for it. Now, let's get into the actual class. That is the Surangama Sutra. The Surangama Sutra is such a supreme teaching. From certain aspect, I can see how people have developed such devotion towards this sutra, maybe because of the history, because of the certain connection that you have with the Zen Buddhism. Therefore, the teachings that's taught in the Surangama Sutra is in fact quite taken seriously by the Chinese practitioners. And this one, particularly compared to the previous teachings that we've studied, I think many people probably take this one more seriously than the others, which are the Diamond Sutra, the Amitabha Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and so on. And I can definitely see that you have more devotion and more faith in the Surangama Sutra. I can tell by my observation. And by the beginning of the teaching of Surangama Sutra, I saw lots of auspicious signs. In fact, I don't usually talk about auspicious signs, and I don't usually believe in those most of the time. But there are definitely some auspicious coincidences that happened. Maybe they're just a coincidence. Maybe they are auspicious coincidences. Anyhow, today is 2019, September the 9th, which we have triple nines in the dates. And in Chinese, the 9 means eternity, or 9 sounds very similar to eternity. When I first encounter this Surangama Sutra, it in fact has 1999 September the 9th, which included 4 nights, and from that day till today, it's been 20 years exactly. Therefore, this is such 4 nights. It has such auspicious and important symbolism to me, and I think it's part of the auspicious signs. Back then it was 4 nights, and today, when we're actually giving this teaching on the Surangama Sutra, we coincidentally have the 3 nights again, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Such supreme auspicious connection. When Master Xu Yun was giving the Sutra, he said that right before the Surangama Sutra, there was this Utapala flower that all of a sudden blossomed, which was quite wonderful and really beautiful, and it didn't wither for a long period of time. Therefore, we can notice that although Master Xu Yun doesn't have much of the writings on the Dharma teachings, but his main teaching and the main commentary is on Surangama Sutra, where Master Xu Yun said that by reading the Tripitaka, in fact, if you could read in detail, then it plants a good seed in your mind. But if you were to just flip through and skipping the content, then it doesn't really have much of the merit. However, when it comes to Surangama Sutra, if you were to read the Surangama Sutra alone, the merit that it could bring you is quite great. Even if you just read the sutra itself without referring to any commentaries, the merit is incalculable. Some scholars from Peking University, they used to say that Master Xu Yun's chronicles were made by the later generations. Master Xu Yun couldn't have lived to 120 years. That cannot be true. Some scholars hold such ideas, but later on, there are other scholars who then found factual evidence to prove Master Xu Yun's birthday and birth date and death date, which then further prove that Master Xu Yun indeed lived for 120 years. For example, one of these evidences was that Master Xu Yun, when he was young, he was forced to get married, and his wife at that time sent letters to him before, and it was dated. So through such kind of evidence, as well as the evidence that's studied and proved by Master Ben Huan. Master Ben Huan was the disciple of Master Xu Yun. There was I think, a documentary. The name is 100 Years of Master Xu Yun. I didn't finish watching the whole documentary, but I think the majority of the content was indeed quite touching. For example, part of Master Xu Yun's life when he was young was indeed very different than those of other children. I think there were about 20 or so series of episodes of this documentary on Master Xu Yun. In fact, instead of watching other movies and so on, why don't you watch the documentaries or other movies about the previous masters? Wouldn't that be even better? Because You are what you watch. You are whatever kind of information you receive. You will become the kind of person that you want to be, or that is based on the information that you receive. I think in that documentary, according to that documentary, Master Xu Yun was born back in 1840, and then he lived for 120 years. And the whole history was well documented. The scholars nowadays, they only give very vague and really they only use very vague evidence to support their thesis. And those kind of studies could fool lots of people who don't really study. For example, in the previous class, we've already discussed about the whether this sutra is false or is a true sutra. In fact, the majority of the people don't have the ability to distinguish whether this sutra is genuine or not. On top of that, they would listen to other people's words without having the wisdom to discern for themselves. And as I said last time, in fact, the mistake that you could create by taking this sutra as a fake sutra, or even propagate such an idea, to others is probably worse than those of the butchers. That you would destroy other people's spiritual path. In fact, the karmic debt that you owe them would be that you do not have the opportunity to receive the correct teaching, the truth of everything, the truth of phenomena for eons. Because the butchers would only kill people's physical body, or the butcher would only kill sentient beings' physical body, but the ones who slander the sutra, in fact, they kill the spiritual body of people. Just like a poisonous snake would only harm a person, but if you were to stop other people's spiritual path, such kind of bad karma is much more detrimental. Devadatta and others, bad spiritual leaders, could be your spiritual guidance, and you would continue such wrong path if you were to make such wrong mistake. Some great masters, in their lifetime, sometimes they would manifest in a way that they would slander certain kind of dharma, but then when they approach their senior age or at a certain time of their life, they would repent such kind of mistake that they've made, to demonstrate that's what people should do as well. Just as like Master Hong Yi, that is a famous master in China. Lots of doubts, suspicion, and different opinions were discussed the last class. So later on, whenever it's necessary, I will in detail discuss and explain and study with everyone about why there are some people would take the sutra as a fake sutra from different aspects, such as history, such as other kind of factors. So we'll discuss further if it was necessary. Some teachers or some geshis from Tibet, if they were to go out and study in good monasteries, then they would be able to become really good masters. They'd be able to then later on benefit people in certain areas. However, there are people who then went to a monastery, for example, or a school where they only cherish the words instead of the actual practice. Therefore, what's really important is to have a good spiritual guidance, to have a good teacher. Of course, there are people who are very eloquent. They're quite articulate and they can influence lots of people. Not only that they're influential in good aspects, they could also be influential in bad aspects. During Second World War, Hitler at that time, he was quite influential, isn't he? Whenever he gives a speech, thousands and thousands of people would get really touched. He was very articulate, really eloquent, and at that time, whatever he spoke, his speech would make a great influence, and the people would listen to him, and the people would believe in him, and would feel that the Jews are the kind of people from the description from Hitler's speech. So, such kind of influence sometimes could be good and sometimes could be bad. Sometimes it could be beneficial, sometimes it could be not beneficial, not only to a person, but to a society. Therefore, whatever we propagate, whatever idea that we try to propagate it to others, I think we should be very objective. I think we should try to benefit others, and we should based on factors on factual evidence rather than only based on what you've heard. This is quite an important point. Therefore, the Surangama Sutra, later on, I think when I have an opportunity, I will also share some of the commentary where it talks about the merits of Surangama Sutra, as well as the historical, as well as the masters from the history and their insights that they've gained through studying of this sutra. The first story I would like to tell you is from the Tang Dynasty. There was a master, his name is Wei Que. Master Wei Que, according to the Song Dynasty's great history of great masters, once he went to Fan Rong's home. If you remember Fan Rong, he was the cabinet who translated or helped into translation of the Surangama Sutra into Chinese. And when he visited Fan Rong at his home, at that time, Fan Rong took out the 10 volumes of the Surangama Sutra, and he then gifted each volume to each one of the monastics, where he invited 10 monastics into his home at that time, and Master Wei Que was one of them. Of course, in history, there's another explanation that Master Wei Que, in fact, received the Surangama Sutra from Master Shinxu, and he received the 4th volume of the Surangama Sutra. At that time, Master Fan Rong gifted each volume to different monastic. It wasn't really described very clearly in the history. Anyhow, at that time, he offered this opportunity for these 10 monastics to make auspicious connections to this Surangama Sutra. And upon receiving this 4th volume of Surangama Sutra, Master Wei Chue arose great confidence in this teaching. And in order to write a commentary up on this sutra, for 11 years, the Master Wei Chue supplicated to Manjushri. For 11 years, that's quite dedicated. And once in his pure vision, pure perception, he saw Manjushri enters into his mouth and dissolved into his body. And then right after that, he was able to start writing commentary on the Surangama Sutra, and he composed a commentary on the 3 volumes of Surangama Sutra. And after finished composing this commentary, he dreamt that Manjushri left him through his mouth again. And after that, he was not able to write anymore. So sometimes we can see it's just like Ponso Rinpoche. He has 3 types of writings. One is terma, one is his commentary, and one is his commentary on the sutras, and the other one is on the tantras. So in the mainland area, lots of great masters, including Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, and great masters in the Chinese history, what they've said in common is that the commentary that they all study is the commentary that's written by Master Wei Chue. The other one is Master Guanding. I'm not sure if that refers to Master Qi Yi, in fact, but the time is a little bit off if it were him. Maybe it was. Maybe it was the disciple of Master Qi Yi, because Master Qi was 100 or 200, in fact 200 years prior to the translation of Surangama Sutra into Chinese language. In Ming Dynasty, there was a master. His name was Master Zhen Jian. And through the studying of Surangama Sutra, he gained full realization. In fact, after he gained realization and insights, and he decided to get ordained. And after he got ordained, he read Surangama Sutra for 10 years. Master Jin Jian continued to read the sutra and study the sutra for 10 years. And during his once he got ill and dreamt of the 3 saints of the West, that those are Mahatamprata and Avalokiteshvara and Amitabha. And he said that in his dream he told the 3 saints, saying that I cannot go with you to the Pure Land because I have to write commentaries on the Surangama Sutra. And after he got well, after he woke up, he got well, and then he started composing this commentary. Of course, his commentary was not all received. It was some people slandered him, and some people really praised him for this commentary. I think when it comes to writing commentaries, and when it comes to transcripts, when it comes to writing books, I really hope that on one hand, it really helps people to read the transcripts of the classes very quickly. That's really wonderful. I know that they do their commentaries and transcripts really quickly and provide the transcripts very timely to the others so that they can review the class. This is providing the necessary convenience. But I think later you have to provide this short sentence saying that this is not the final version so that people would know that this is not the final version, that there are and there could be some mistakes that's included in these transcripts, in the very timely yet rather quite rushed transcripts. Therefore, I think it's quite necessary to revise the first transcript and edit the first transcript and take some time for it to get better written and without any mistakes. This is quite important. Because when it comes to benefiting the later generation, I think it's quite necessary to then revise, and it's quite necessary to make corrections and to make sure that all the things written down are factual. For example, earlier I was translating the teachings collected by lots of the disciples, the teachings taught by Ponsogar Rinpoche. Sometimes when I read some of the teachings, I felt like, wow, this teaching is quite precious. It's so wonderful, and I am so grateful for people who've then collected this teaching and written it down. And sometimes when I read certain titles and I have no idea what they're talking about, and then I try to ask who the editor is. None of them wanted to say that they're the bad editor. Therefore, I think it's quite necessary to ask each editor to write their names there so that I can find each of the person who is responsible for each of the transcripts of the teaching. So sometimes my feelings would fluctuate when I flip through the book that has Ponsogar Rinpoche's teaching. Sometimes I feel rather quite grateful and happy. Sometimes I feel really quite upset about that. I don't really understand what it is. Of course, the other aspect of it is the collection of the teachings and all the aspects of a great master. From yesterday or today, actually, I really want to start collecting the audios and videos of Ponsogar Rinpoche. And I would hand this job to the female disciples. It used to be the task of the male practitioners, but I would like to then hand over this job to the female practitioners because the male disciples, they have lots of work and they couldn't find the proper, the appropriate people to do so. And from yesterday and today onwards, I really want to collect all the Ponsogar Rinpoche's audio as well as video that is given in China as well as abroad. Even if it's just a teaching of a stanza, even if it's one lyric song by him or so, any of these kind of audio or videos, I really want to collect them because it would be quite precious. And if we don't do this now, I think the disciples of Ponsogar Rinpoche would then pass away, and it's going to get even more difficult to collect the audios and the videos of Ponsogar Rinpoche. I think I've mentioned it before. I really rejoice Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples whom collected the videos and audios of Trungpa Rinpoche. They've collected and protected in some ways, as well as organized it really professionally and quite proficiently. Also, it has something to do with the equipment at that time. In fact, our equipment we had was really not sufficient. The audio and video, they were all quite blurry and fuzzy, but the equipment Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples had in United States were quite excellent. All the video and audios recorded in his centers was quite precious and valuable that we can use nowadays, and we can still see Phuntsok Rinpoche right now. Therefore, such a kind of wealth, the wealth of our spiritual treasure, or the wealth of our culture, all of these kind of videos and audios, in fact, is quite necessary to preserve, as this is an important aspect of our wealth. On top of the videos and audios, in fact, Trungpa Rinpoche's disciples also wrote a lot of the encounters, stories of encounters. They didn't write down lots of those stories or something like almost like a fairy tale story, such like my teacher could fly and so on. In fact, his disciples wrote down the factual evidence, the factual encounters, such as what time and when this disciple had met the teacher, whether there's a smile of the teacher, what kind of trigger, what kind of emotion that triggers this disciple, and so on. Today, in fact, I felt that these kind of stories are quite necessary to record. I was thinking of the movie Inception, where there was a gadget that could remind the person that of the storyline. And when I was reading back into my calendar, some of the little notes that I wrote down in my calendar that was 20 years ago, in fact, it could trigger me of the memories back then. In the West, in the simultaneous as well as consecutive translations, in fact, the scholars and the interpreters, they would use some very short symbols to trigger their memory, and that could remind them what kind of logic links and what kind of contents was stated. So I think such kind of translation and interpretation is rather quite wondrous. It's quite interesting to be able to use some symbols to remind them the whole content. Phuntsok Rinpoche used to do so, that he would teach for half an hour straight, and then he would ask me to translate to others, and while waiting for me to translate, he would then eat his tsampa, he would take his medicine, he would drink his tea, and at that time I would continuously to speak, and I would stand at the window of the shrine hall and speak to the whole audience and so on. And Phuntsok Rinpoche would, after a while, look at me and saying that, "Have you finished translating?" And sometimes I would write because the content is so long, sometimes it would take for about half an hour. And then I would write down some short forms or shorthands for certain names, such as Atisha. I would just write an A and so on. In fact, before 1999, between 1987 till 1999, I was translating for Phuntsok Rinpoche in the consecutive format. And then in 1999, I found that there's such equipment that could help us to have the simultaneous interpretation. Therefore, I started the simultaneous between 1999 to 2004. or rather 2003. I think simultaneous interpretation is rather quite timely, and it could convey the information really quickly. Each masters have rather very different styles. For example, there are the teachers who would say, when I went to India, and then wait for the interpreter to say that when I went to India. But there are the Rinpoches or masters who would speak for a long period of time and wait for the translator to finish. I remember that Chunlei Rinpoche, who is the father of Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, I think it probably Sanjay Kongjo told me this story that Chunlei Rinpoche would speak for half an hour and then left the shrine hall and let the translator to translate while he walks around in the garden and enjoy the scenery in the garden. So he would walk around to look at the flowers, and the translator would translate the joke part, and the disciples would all laugh. And the Chunlei Rinpoche would look at the flowers and also laugh along with them outside of the tent where where the translator and all the disciples are in. So he would come back after a long time, and he would ask the translator, "Have you finished translating? If not, then okay, I'm gonna come back later, okay?" So different masters and translators, they all have a very, very different style. I don't know where I got that. Anyhow, I was talking about. Anyhow, I was going to tell you a few stories so that we can finally got back into the actual text. Anyhow, my point was that in terms of translation, in terms of transcripts, in terms of writing books, I think people should be rather quite serious about it, especially when it comes to the written words. It's quite crucial to make sure that they're very accurate, because they will last for a long time to benefit future generations. On the other hand, we should collect the stories, the teachings, and the sounds and the videos and the life stories of great masters. So as the disciples, we should carry such responsibility of doing so, because it would influence whether you can continue such lineage. If we can carry such responsibility and successfully carry such videos and audios and all of these kind of stories and teachings that's passed down from our previous masters, then we can call ourselves successful. We've fulfilled our responsibility. As Buddhists, in fact, a group of us, I understand that a group of you, in fact, placed the importance or focused on the aspect of building architectures and doing all these kind of propagation. And there are a group of people who then have a great interest and hold up responsibility of continue with the aspect of the teaching. So the thing that we are currently doing is that we want to continue the voices and the videos, or rather keep such materials to the future generations. The great masters, not only that they did not harm any sentient beings, in fact, they've only benefited sentient beings. In any kind of situation they're in, aging or illness or even death, all of such kind of actions are only done to benefit sentient beings. So for such great bodhisattvas, we should keep their teachings and their stories so that all of these kind of information could benefit the sentient beings in the future generations, and it could carry such energy and such blessings that's given by the great master, the great bodhisattva. If it was not to benefit the future generation, if it was not for the benefit of a future generation, we don't really have to spend such energy and such effort. So, with the keeping such intention in mind of benefiting sentient beings, I think is quite important to carry on this teaching, carry on the previous master's teaching. So now let's continue. I had no idea how I got so distracted. Anyhow, we haven't really got into the actual teaching yet. But anyway, let's move rather quite slow and steady in the teaching of Surangama Sutra. I really hope these kind of stories and my talks could give rise to your devotion. Anyhow, let's get into the actual content. Thus have I heard. Once the Buddha stayed in the Jatmana Vihara near Shravasti with 1,250 bhikshus, most of whom were great arhats who had crossed the stream of transmigration. That's the only thing that we are going to study. Do you think there's nothing to talk about with the first sentence? And that's not going to happen. Last year, when we were studying the Vimalakirti Sutra and other sutras, we talked about the beginning from the aspect of the 5 perfections, and today we're going to study this part from the 6th accomplishment that is widely taught in the mainland Buddhism, in the great masters in mainland Buddhism. And the 6 accomplishment, what are those 6 accomplishments? They're quite similar to the 5 perfections. Master Zishuan, who was one of the great masters who wrote the commentary on the Surangama Sutra, and he also, along with many other Chinese masters in the commentary of the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment, they stated these 6 kinds of accomplishment. The first one is the accomplishment of faith, and that is thus. The second one is the accomplishment of listening. I heard, and the third one is accomplishment of time. That is the 3 times, and then the accomplishment of the master, who is the Buddha, and the accomplishment of the place, and that is the Jatmana Vihara, and the accomplishment of assembly, that is the 1,250 bhikshus. So let's begin with the first one. Thus have I heard. So thus is quite important. It means that truthfully and faithfully that have I heard this teaching. Not only thus have I heard, it's thus have I recorded in such a way as well. So you have to have faith in terms of hearing as well as recording. It is not that the sutra was written down based on conceptual ideas or habitual patterns that is rather defiled. It is completely what the Buddha had taught. So it is stated as, thus have I heard. It is said that the Dharma is like the great ocean. You can enter the ocean of Dharma with faith, and you can cross the ocean of Dharma with wisdom. Therefore, any kinds of the teachings and that's included in the Dharma, you have to have faith. Because if you don't have faith, you won't be able to you won't be able to understand it, and if you don't have it in the middle, you won't be able to persist in studying the Dharma. And then at the end, if you don't have the faith, you won't be able to fulfill or completely comply the Dharma. So those are in the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have to all have faith. In the West nowadays, and the students don't fully follow their teacher because creativity and personal opinion is encouraged. However, in the Eastern philosophy, it is quite important for the disciples, for the students, to truthfully written down and record what the teacher had taught. There was this conversation that happens between the Buddha and his disciples, as well as, for example, even in the Analects of Confucius, it was truthfully recorded. The Buddha's teaching, as well as the students' answers. Therefore, the word "thus" is quite important to remember. So that's the first one. Thus, the accomplishment of faith. The second accomplishment is the accomplishment of hearing. That's have I heard. I refers to Shariputra, refers to Madhgalyayana, and so on. All of these great arhats. These great arhats have heard these teachings. Over here, I refers to Podagala. In the heretics, they would hold onto the self as the solid existence of self, and in Buddhism there are three types of different kinds of self, and the self that is the name, and the self that is then the true self, and so on. But over here, the I shows it that refers to the arhats who have truthfully heard these kind of teachings. And the third one talks about the accomplishment of time. On one hand, in India at that time, there's no tradition of recording the time, the specific time. On the other hand, the way we can understand the accomplishment of time is through the three times. In history, we usually then talk about at a certain time and time this political event happened, or something happened. So this kind of a time is quite necessary to record. However, these kind of teaching that is included in the Dharma is not subjugated to the change of time. It's not going to change based on the change of time, unlike the news nowadays that we have. So that's the accomplishment of time. That is the perfect time at all times. And then the fourth accomplishment is the accomplishment of the master, who is the Buddha. The word Buddha means the awakened one, the enlightened one. Therefore, over here, the accomplishment of the master is the Buddha. And he only speaks of the truth. He does not lie to us. He does not deceive the sentient beings. And the merits of the Buddha was taught in other different sutras and shastras, where it talks about how the Buddha then eradicated the two kinds of obscurations and enlightened fully to the wisdom. And the teaching that's given by the Buddha, in fact, is truthful and beneficial to others. This is widely taught in other teachings. The accomplishment, the fourth one is the fifth one is the accomplishment of place, that is the Jetavana Vihara. The sixth one is the accomplishment of the retinues or assemblies.
那其他地方呢，就是得的时间都是并不是很长的。我记得大智度论当中也有
According
一些
to
这个问答吧，就是
Mahaprajnaparamita
这个问就是为什么佛陀呢
Avatara,
就是
it
大智
says
度
that
是他的这个故乡，
the
他在那里就是待的时间不长。
the Buddha, in fact,
全部是
didn't
在
stay
另外一
for a
个
long
国家
period
待
of
的时
time
间
in
更
his
长
hometown,
然后这个
but
回答的
he
话呢
stayed
就是
in
但是
other
如果
places
佛陀
for a
他
longer
自己
period
没
of
有
time.
来信，本来
And there are
在
people
待在
question
迦毗
why
罗
doesn't
也
know
好
the
其他地
Buddha
方
stay
也
at
一
his
样
hometown?
但是如果在迦毗
And
罗
the
国的
answer
话呢，就
is
是
that the
佛
Buddha,
陀
in
以
fact,
外的
doesn't
其
have
他人都
any
不是迦毗罗
grasping
这些人
towards
呢不会
the
来信。有
places.
些人认为是佛陀是我们这边的人，他们是来
There are
信。
people
有
who
些人呢就是认为是
would
这个
feel that
什么释迦族是我们的院弟，就是他们才是称恨信的，所以他们
the
有很多
Shakya
而且可能
family
佛陀也
is
是当
the
时
enemy or is a friend or a foe.
度化的，就是所以就佛陀
Some
呢就
some say
因为
that
大
the
智度
most
论当中
difficult
佛陀呢
ones
并不是因
to
为
help
必须得
are the
待的地
ones
方是
who
好玩啊，或者是其他的，看哪个众生
are your family
有这
members
个
or
缘分的，
are
到
from
哪里
your
去度
hometown.
众生，就是所以呢，就是色为称呢，就是应该是他
So
最
the Buddha,
最
in
最
fact,
有缘，因
stayed
为那里的
in
这个国王啊，
Jetavana
很多
Vihara,
人的话呢
Jetavana for a
特
long
别
period of
特别
time,
有
the
有信心
Shravasti for a
所
long
以呢
period of
他
time.
在哪里呢，就是待的时间
He,
比较
in fact,
长
the Buddha had
就比较长。
more
当
auspicious
然我们
connections
看到
with
那个
the
发现
city
和
of
那个
Shravasti.
唐僧的这种这个西域界啊，
The
就是这些相
discovery
关的这
of
个书里
different
面看的话，那就
places
是当时他们去的
where
时候
the
都是这些
Buddha
地
taught,
方都是
where the
一个
Buddha
废墟
gave
啊，
teaching
比如
and
说
the
孔像
significant places
这个
where Buddha
这
went
样
or
后来
stayed
呢，他
didn't get
发现
discovered
这个
until the 18th century, and it was only
原来唐维宝去的时候。
based on the journal that is written down by Master Faxian and Master Xuanzang.
这里的有些情况
When we went there with Ponsogo Rinpoche, Ponsogo Rinpoche
是这个地方的话呢，
give lots of teachings on how long the Buddha stayed, and
加持力的。
the Ponsogo Rinpoche told us, in fact, that Shravasti was one of the most blessed place where the Buddha stayed for a long period of time, and therefore it is the most blessed place, and so on. All these kind of stories. Lots of the holy places, the pilgrimage sites in India.
应该可以这么讲。讲印度圣地是吧？
We're talking about the pilgrimage sites in India.
圣地是这样的，就是现在是成为那个佛教的圣地。但是
It was recognized as pilgrimage sites or the holy places of Buddhists.
以前那个印度确
We can talk about these kind of places now.
就是时过境迁了，就应该
In the way that, in fact, lots of the places was quite glorious back in the history. However, now because of the changes in time in history, many of the great holy sites were
印度人
taken away or were abandoned.
以前的历史上看，
Compared to history,
这个龙目大结晶也是
where Chandragirti, in terms of Nagarjuna, and all of these great Indian masters, whenever we read these kind of texts composed by the great Indian masters, we all feel such great admiration towards them.
其他的
But nowadays, in the modern time, there weren't not much great Indian scholars or great Indian Buddhists, great Indian Buddhist masters, although they're quite talented in other kind of areas, such as the scientists and engineers working for Boeing and working in Silicon Valley. The great companies in United States, they all like the engineers and information technology engineers. In India, now the so-called Indian Silicon Valley is Bombay, and MIT, the Massachusetts Information Technology Institute is, or the IIT, the India one is quite comparable to the one of the MIT in United States. So from different aspects, we can see that the Indian people are still very smart, except that not many of the great philosophers compared to the ones that they've had in the history. How lots of the Buddhist sites were discovered, in fact, all the credits goes back to Alexander Cunningham, who was a British. We should remember this archaeologist's contribution. Though he's only a scholar and an archaeologist, but he had discovered and he had then reviewed lots of the Buddhist sites from ashes, from the abandoned places. Alexander Cunningham was a great archaeologist who discovered or rediscovered many of the important Buddhist sites. Alexander Cunningham stayed with the army at that time, with the British army, and he saw this rock where it has lots of scriptures on it, and he asked around, and not many people recognize such words anymore, and they said maybe it's the ancient writings of Buddhists. By that time, coincidentally, the translation of Master Faxian as well as Master Xuanzang's journal was translated into English language, and then he read those two books. He compared the writings of the descriptions of those two masters' writings, and then he went back to India again to start to rediscover around those areas around 1837. Around 1837, he reviewed of the site and determined that the site of Deer Park, at that time Deer Park was already taken by the Jainism, and he also reviewed the place of Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, as well as the Mahabodhi Temple. Back in 12th and 13th century, the Muslim army invaded all the Buddhist temples and holy sites, and in order to protect the Mahabodhi Temple, the monks over there buried the entire temple, the entire Mahabodhi Temple, into with the sand and soil, and made it into a small hill. Back in 1961, this archaeologist Alexander Cunningham, then he reviewed this is the place where Mahabodhi Temple is, and discovered it and dug it out of the hill. So his finding goes hand in hand with the help of the Master Xuanzang as well as the Master Faxian's writing, their books, because in the ancient times the Indian people did not have the habits of record their history, and lots of the history was discovered later on with the writings of people who traveled to India. In fact, from the external area at that time, Mahabodhi was not found. Lots of the Buddhist holy sites was later on taken by different religions, such as the deer park was taken by Jainism and used it as a pigsties. Another place that is called Odatampuri, that was a temple. In fact, it was one of the 3 most important temples in India. At the most prosperous time, at its peak time, there were about 12,000 monks studying over there in Uddatapuri temple. Marpa as well as Naropa, and all of these great saints, they studied over here at Uddatapuri. When Marpa Lotsawa, who was actually Tibetan, but he traveled quite often to India, and he went to this temple and told Naropa, saying that I have a disciple. His name is Milarepa. Milarepa, in fact, received the prediction from received guidance from the Dakinis and said that he should study the practice of exchanging consciousness, taking consciousness. And then Naropa recited this verse where he said, in the grave darkness that is in the north, there was a master who is just like the sun when the sun shines on the snow peak. To such a great illuminating master, I prostrated to great master Milarepa. And when Naropa folded his hands and prostrated towards the direction of Tibet to show his reverence to Milarepa, and then all of the mountains and vegetations at that time prostrated towards the same direction along with Naropa. So even till now, all the mountains and vegetations are still leaning to the direction of Tibet, seeming that they are prostrating or they are venerating Milarepa, who was in Tibet at that time. At that time, we really wanted to go to Uddatapuri Temple. There are two kinds of architecture that is quite commonly seen in Tibet, and one of those are based on the architectural style of Uddatapuri. And that place is Sangye Temple. Sangye Temple adapts this architectural style. But the temple, the Uddatapuri Temple, in fact, it was completely destroyed by Muslim army at that time, back in the 12th and 13th century. There was nothing left. And on top of the ashes and the collapsed temple, there was the temple of, or rather the a Muslim's charnel ground where they bury corpse. So between then till the 18th century, Buddhism was Buddhism tradition as well as its holy sites were all buried or destroyed, and lots of the tradition didn't really continue, didn't really last, and that is why you cannot find many of the archaeological sites in India of Buddhism. Sri Lankan master who brought lots of disciples and reconstructed the Sangha over there at Mahabodhi. There's some old photos or illustrations of Mahabodhi when they rediscovered this temple. At that time, the Lhasa Jowo statue was also enshrined on the second level of Mahabodhi. And according to some of the historical record, it was that the Jowo statue was originally at Mahabodhi and then later on brought to Tibet through the princess, when Princess Wenchen came into Tibet. He brought that as a gift. So sometimes when we look into the history, we would see that the conflicts among people, among different religions, really made lots of the detrimental destructions that cannot be recovered. Lots of the other religions are not like Buddhism. Lots of the philosophies are not like Buddhism, where we talk about avoid all evil and practice all good. They're not as inclusive. Buddhism and all other kinds of religions should, in fact, learn from such history, especially. We should remember such historical stories where, in fact, we should learn from such histories. And we should use different means to protect and to preserve different kinds of teachings, as well as artifacts, as well as the master's teachings, and so on. So the Buddhists should really have great gratitude towards Alexander Cunningham, because without him we would not be able to go to all these great pilgrimage sites such as Mahabodhi and Deer Park. I don't think I'll be able to finish teaching even the first sentence. I only talked about the fifth. Yeah, the fifth accomplishment, and the sixth one, maybe we'll talk about this next class, okay? Here it talks about the 1,250 bhikshus. Okay, we'll extend it to next class tomorrow.